Good to see everybody. My name is Nate, if I haven't met you, and it is an honor to be able to spend this time with you. I love that we are celebrating the birthday of a person who changed the world. There aren't many people that you celebrate their birthday 2,000 years after they die, right? Because something happened that changed the face of our planet. So thank you so much for being a part of the celebration. Hey, before we begin, I want to say a brief thank you. They chatted a little bit about Increase Christmas, but it's this opportunity where we give everything that comes in, goes out the door. And to this point, we're almost approaching $400,000 that's been given, and more is coming in all the time. And that's really going to make an impact. Thank you. That is beautiful. I love it. So a few weeks back in December, we started looking at just one book of the Bible, one of the biographies of Jesus' life. It's written by a man named John. John was one of the men who spent 3 years with Jesus. And his introduction in chapter 1 of his book is very, very different than you might anticipate. It's like the non-Christmas story. So instead of shepherds and magi and Mary and Joseph and baby Jesus and shepherds and angels, which you read about in Matthew and Luke, John writes this poem. And it's a poem that's often referred to as cosmic poetry because he uses language that you'd find in the very first chapter of the Bible. And rather than telling us the details of what happened, he wants us to think deeply about the meaning of what happened. And so over the past few weeks, we've looked at John stating this in the first chapter of his biography of Jesus' life, that Jesus is God and Jesus is creator, that Jesus is light and life. And here's what I'd like to look at for Christmas Eve services, is that John says this about Jesus, that Jesus is actually God in the flesh, and that Jesus is both grace and truth. Grace and truth. Let's read the last section from John chapter 1 as John introduces us to the person of Jesus. The word, logos, ultimate truth, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John, Jesus' cousin, testified concerning him. He cried out saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me.'" Speaking of the ancient eternal origins of Jesus. Verse 16, out of his fullness, the fullness of Jesus, we have all, notice that, not a few of us, we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law, the truth, was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God but the one and only Son, who is himself God and is in closest relationship with the Father. He's made him known. Jesus is God in the flesh. Now, what does that mean? We have the word Emmanuel, which means God with us. It's a Latin word. But Jesus is God in the flesh. John specifically uses some very interesting words, and he is trying to, we may not catch this 2,000 years later and all the cultural differences, but he is trying to rattle the cages of first century readers of his book. It's an assault upon a lot of the things that they assume to be true. So he uses one word, skene in the Greek, which means dwelt among us. Literally, if you translated that word from Greek into English, it would mean that he pitched his tent in our midst. That this God who everyone had considered to be far away, distant, unknowable, maybe unflappable, out of touch with human experience, that this guy came and pitched his tent in our midst. And then he uses another term, incarne, which means, carne is meat in Spanish, right? A Latin root. It means he came in the flesh, the literal flesh. I just finished a book this week. It was a book about the Battle of Shiloh during the Civil War. And the book had this picture. And as I was thinking about what John is communicating in this picture, the two came together for me. This is a Battle of Shiloh. On the bottom right is a federal soldier. The men sitting to his left are Confederate prisoners. And this is part of the battlefield. And when you read this short period of time, it was a horrific experience. 24,000 people lose their lives. The weather's terrible. It's raining. And during the entire Civil War, people lived in tents just like that. And the conditions were abysmal, unsanitary, violent. And here's what John is saying. That God became flesh and blood and set up his tent in the midst of our unsanitary, broken, violent world. He came to be with us. Now, this concept that God became flesh would have been shocking to the two groups of people who would have originally read this. The first group would be those we'd call part of the Greco-Roman world. So Rome is in charge, but Greece is so influenced philosophically, Rome, that people were called Greco-Roman because they had a way of thinking. And this is what they have believed. They've been taught this by their greatest philosophers, Plato and Socrates. It was a dualistic worldview, which meant this. There were two parts to reality. This is what every Greek, every Roman believed. And one part was called the physical world. Okay, that's the world that when I look at you, you look at me, you look at the person next to you, you look at the wall, you look at your television, whatever it is, it's what you can see, it's tangible. And it is, here's what they believed about the physical world. It's broken and it's irredeemable. It is completely lacking any sense of being sacred. It's this broken world that we live in, which led to all kinds of ways where they lived this out. Okay, so there's this material world, but then there's another reality, and the two never intersect. It's the world of the spiritual realm or the immaterial realm. Plato called it the realm of perfect ideals. So this is this spiritual realm, and they believed that the two were completely separate and never intersected. There was no chance of that because this spiritual world is pure and it's sacred and it's untouched by the brokenness of the physical world. And here's what John is saying to them. It would have been unfathomable. He's saying this, that Jesus has brought the two worlds together. That Jesus, who is this divine creature, does not stay in the spiritual realm. He becomes, and John uses this word, flesh. He takes on not just attributes or looks like a human being, but he actually becomes flesh and blood. The divine and the material world have now come together in the person of Jesus, which has all sorts of implications. If you're from the Greco-Roman world, suddenly you're realizing maybe this physical world isn't irredeemable. Maybe what happens in the physical world actually matters because God enters into this physical reality. So that's the Greco-Roman world. They read this and they're thinking, that's impossible. The two never come together. The other group of listeners would have been the Jewish people. And the Jewish people had this perspective about God, is that you could only find God in a sacred place. That there were these unique places that were set up for human beings and God to come together. And this begins in the first chapter of the Bible where God creates a garden, and this garden is in Eden, and there's this sacred place called the garden where Adam and Eve and God come together, and there's harmony and there's peace, and there's communication, and then that is violently interrupted in Genesis chapter 3. And the next time we find a sacred place where Jewish people felt like they could find God is in the story of the Exodus. It's Jewish people leaving slavery from Egypt. They're going to be nomadic for 40 years, traveling through the Sinai Peninsula. And God says this, I want to have proximity to human life, but we'll have to do it in a sacred place. So they create this thing called a tabernacle. It's like a temple, but because you're nomads, you can pack it up and carry it wherever you're going. And it has an outward wall. And if someone wanted to interact with God, there's this entire process of purifying yourself ritually, making sacrifices, and then you could step past the divider line and you could come into the sacred place of the tabernacle and have an interaction with God. Later, when they settled in Israel, they built a permanent tabernacle called the temple. And then at the hub of their culture are these multiple events every year where everyone comes, and wherever you live, you come to Jerusalem and you come to the temple, because the temple is the place where you find God. It's the sacred place, the sacred place. And what is John telling them? He uses Exodus language. He says, we've seen his glory. That the presence of God is no longer limited to some sacred place where you may or may not be worthy to go. But instead, the presence of God, the glory of God, has pitched his tent in our very midst. And it's not about whether or not you have achieved the right to be with God. God has come to us. So the implications are unending. The search for God, the ongoing ancient search for God. Where is he? How do I achieve him? Do I do more, try harder? What is it? John says this: God has now taken up residence in the midst of this material world. And rather than us trying to find him, he has found us. John doesn't stop there. Indeed, Jesus is God in the flesh, but he says there are two very distinct things that came with Jesus. In fact, we could probably call them gifts to humanity. Jesus is grace and Jesus is truth. These two things that Jesus brought to the planet. So, truth. I mean, it is a question that I think human beings have been asking since the dawn of time. What is truth? What is truth? Brilliant minds, cultures have pursued this. What is truth? And people have come to different conclusions. Even in our world today, it's a little bit awkward talking about this, because very common in our culture is this thing that we call relativism. And relativism says, well, there's not a distinct truth, there's multiple truths. And so you'll hear people say, well, that's your truth, but that's not my truth. And it's a little bit challenging, because what if my truth offends your truth? Like, is there truth, or are there multiple truths? And the question is there truth, right? Like, what's truth? And here's what John says: when Jesus came to planet Earth in the flesh, took up residence in our midst, he brought truth. John says, formerly we had truth in the law, this 10 commandments that God gave to Moses. And that was an original form of grace. But now you don't find truth in a book, you find truth in a person. And so Jesus wanders the earth for 3 years, declaring truth, showing truth, demonstrating what truth is. So if you've asked yourself what is truth, you have to struggle with this question. Can I have my own truth? Relativism is not new. Genesis chapter 3, the third chapter in the Bible, guess what Adam and Eve decided to do? Hey, let's make up our own truth. Sound good to you? And God says, there's no room for your truth. There's room for one truth. And so Jesus confronts each and every one of us with this question: what do you believe is truth? And John says Jesus came and brought truth. This is what human life is supposed to be like. What Jesus says about God is truth. What Jesus says about you and I is truth. And the second thing that Jesus came with was grace. Grace. And this is another question that I think every human being has ever asked. Is there any chance for forgiveness? Are there second chances? What do I do with the shame that I experience? I know that I'm broken and inadequate and I failed. Do I make up for that in one way or another? And this is what John says: when Jesus came, not only did he bring truth, but he also brought grace. And grace means this. Grace means that there is a God who forgives imperfect people. Grace means that there is a God who looks at those of us on the fringes and says, you are my son. You are my daughter. Grace means that for people who cannot consistently carry out God's truth, he brings grace. It means there is second chances for each and every one of us. So John, rather than point out the details of the birth of Jesus, he says, here's what I want you to consider as you think about the person of Jesus. He's God in the flesh. He found us so that we wouldn't have to find him. And he is truth and he is grace. It means there's room for you and me. There's forgiveness for the broken. And there is a truth that is not mine, but it is his. And that's available as the gifts that Jesus brought to planet Earth. Will you take a moment and pray with me? Jesus, as we gather in this room, we celebrate your birth, which changed everything. And we celebrate that in concert with people who have lived throughout the centuries, and with people who, in every language imaginable, over the next couple of days are going to celebrate the birth of Jesus. Because when Jesus came, it meant this, that God has taken up residence in our midst. We had never been able to find you, so you came to us. And it means that you have brought truth. And there's something in every human being that chafes at truth. We want to create our own. But Jesus said, let me give you truth. This is who I am. This is who you are. This is a way to live where you can be fully human. And you brought grace, that there is forgiveness and love. In fact, John says this, we have all received grace in place of grace. We received those gifts from the one who came to live in our midst. I wonder if you could close your eyes for just a moment. And I've been praying for a few months now that this Christmas Eve would be an incredibly significant moment for many of us. For those of us who maybe we've wandered, maybe we've been spiritually unresolved, we're not sure what we believe. I really believe that God has you here right now because he is calling you by name. And he is telling you there is grace for you. And there is truth for you. And this God has come to the planet to live in your midst in the unsanitary reality of who you are and where you've been. He says, I am here. If this is your moment for you to surrender to Jesus, to his truth, and receive his grace, I'm going to ask you to do something that takes a lot of courage. Everybody, if you keep your eyes closed, if that's you and you're ready to surrender your life to Jesus, you just raise your hand and wave at me. I want to make eye contact with you. If that's you, yes, yes. Anybody in the center section? Yes, sir. Yes, I see you. You're his. You're his. On my left, you're right, if that's you. Yes, I see both of you there as well. If you're in the balcony, will you just wave at me? Yeah. You're there. Yes. And here and here. All right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of you guys up there. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Your son, you're a daughter of God. Yeah. I see you. I see you. And if you're online or just listening, would you just look into your computer, your TV? The Lord sees you. You're his. You've become a son or daughter of God. Beautiful. Beautiful. Amen. Amen. Hey, would you join me? And we're just so proud of a bunch of people who have made a courageous and life-altering decision